Have you ever wondered what happens when a single question shatters everything you thought was safe? This is the story of a woman who believed curiosity was harmless, until it destroyed her marriage, her family, and her future. What begins as a spark with a stranger soon unravels into betrayal, regret, and a devastating silence that becomes the ultimate revenge. Welcome to Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy stories filled with drama, betrayal, and lessons that cut deep, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to join us for more. Now, let's step into today's story. She opened the marriage door and lost everything in the end. Laura loved the shape of their mornings, the quiet choreography that made life feel almost sacred. The kettle clicked softly, releasing curls of steam into the air while the old apartment seemed to breathe with them, walls carrying the warmth of familiarity. Ethan's tie lay folded neatly on the back of the chair he had been promising for weeks to repair. It was a small detail, but it was theirs, a reminder of the life they were carefully stitching together. They were young, still in their 20s, brimming with earnest plans. Together they saved for the house they dreamed of, one with a yard wide enough for children to run across, and a tall maple tree that would scatter red and gold leaves every October. On Sunday afternoons, they wandered down quiet streets, passing playgrounds filled with laughter, guessing baby names as if the future were a catalog they could order from. Each step felt like a rehearsal for a life that was waiting, a life that promised safety and permanence. Their friends often said they were meant to be, and Laura smiled because it felt true. Stability wasn't dull to her, it was a miracle. She had spent years craving it, yearning for something that would last when so much around her had always felt fragile. In Ethan, she found not only companionship but certainty. Ethan carried a steadiness that made everything seem effortless. He could fix the router without raising his voice, fold towels with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, and he never failed to text if he was going to be even 10 minutes late. He did not perform romance with grand gestures. He practiced it in the quiet ways that mattered. Their dinners were simple but warm. His apologies came quickly and sincerely, and his promises were never empty words. In a culture that treated fidelity like a dare, Ethan made loyalty look ordinary, and in its ordinariness, it became extraordinary. Laura adored him for that quiet competence, for the way his presence settled every room. He did not make life exciting in reckless ways. He made it livable, breathable, safe. And for her, that was love. Her days at the office reflected the same pattern. She knew the squeak of the corridor doors, the jokes that circulated endlessly in accounting, the smell of burnt coffee that lingered in the break room. Predictability was a roof she trusted. Yet every now and then, in the unoccupied minutes between tasks, a whisper visited her. A flicker that asked if there might be more, not because anything was wrong, but because desire has a way of mistaking calm for emptiness. She silenced it quickly, closing it down like a tab on a browser she shouldn't have opened. Adults, she reminded herself, chose value over novelty, substance over flash. Still, the first hairline fractures are always the easiest to ignore. A silence at dinner that stretched a beat too long. A question she drafted in her phone but deleted before pressing send. A pause when Ethan asked how her day had been, and she reached for a brightness that wasn't entirely true. Nothing alarming, just a drift, as subtle as fog rolling in without thunder but refusing to lift. When they spoke of the future, Laura's eyes lit with vivid details. She wanted a porch swing that creaked gently in the wind, a dog that would learn their rhythms and wait by the door, a kitchen window above the sink where morning light could pour in while she brewed coffee. She wanted a calendar filled with birthdays, school concerts, and vacations by a quiet lake. Ethan wanted those things too, but he also had spreadsheets, timelines, budgets, careful plans that mapped their life like a steady flight path. Safety was love to her, and Ethan's certainty anchored that belief. And yet sometimes, walking home, she would glance at couples laughing too loudly outside a bar, their energy spilling into the night. She wondered, just for a moment, what it would feel like to live recklessly for a weekend and then return to safety on Monday. The thought embarrassed her. She loved Ethan. She loved their plans. She tucked the idea away, telling herself it was nothing but fiction. But ideas once born do not simply disappear. They wait. They linger. They gather strength in the silence. One Tuesday in early spring, as rain washed over the city, Laura lingered beneath the office awning, watching drops bead on her coat sleeve. She thought about how easily life flowed past in routines, unasked and unquestioned. For 5 minutes, she imagined stepping into a different story, becoming a different person before returning to the safety of her own. She told herself that wanting something without acting on it was harmless. She pressed the elevator button and went back upstairs. That night, Ethan told her about a client who had lost everything by chasing a reckless deal. He thought he was diversifying, Ethan said, but really he was just gambling with words. Laura laughed, grateful for the metaphor, not realizing it was a warning she would one day come to embody. She leaned into him, touched his wrist, and believed, at least for that moment, that everything was fine. But later, as she loaded the dishwasher, she realized she hadn't hummed in weeks. The silence pressed against her like a notice she hadn't asked to receive. She tested it with a tune, but it sounded hollow, like pretending to be herself. Across the hall, Ethan was making a weekend list, his voice steady, his presence unchanged. She answered when he called out, but something in the space between rooms felt different, stretched, fragile. Every marriage has seams, she told herself. Theirs were beautifully sewn, and if curiosity was only a loose thread, she believed she could tuck it in and forget. She believed that. But storms rarely begin with thunder. Sometimes they begin with nothing more than a thought that refuses to die. It began so quietly that even Laura could pretend it was nothing. Just footsteps echoing in the hallway, the rattle of a delivery cart across the tiles, and the appearance of Marcus, a delivery driver with an easy smile and a voice that carried warmth even in casual greetings. He entered her days without fanfare, his presence no more unusual than the envelopes and packages he carried. But routine has a way of hiding danger in plain sight. Their first conversations were short and harmless, remarks about the weather, jokes about late shipments. Yet Laura noticed herself waiting for them, arranging her tasks so she might be near the front desk when his truck usually arrived. What should have been mundane began to feel like anticipation. She told herself it was nothing, just a friendly exchange. And yet, each time Marcus's brown eyes lingered on hers, something in her chest shifted. His cologne carried faintly on the air, mixed with the dust of cardboard, and she realized her senses remembered him before her mind did. At home, Ethan's steadiness never wavered. He asked about her day, cooked beside her on weekends, folded laundry with that same quiet diligence that had once filled her with gratitude. But the spark Marcus ignited unsettled her. It wasn't love. It wasn't even longing. It was the thrill of being noticed by someone new, the dangerous rush of possibility. She remembered advice she once gave her friends. Commitment means drawing boundaries long before temptation arrives. Yet now she found herself leaning on those boundaries, pressing lightly against them as though testing their strength. She laughed too quickly at Marcus's jokes, lingered a second longer than necessary when handing him a clipboard, caught herself replaying the sound of his laughter during her commute home. Each moment ended with the safe return of routine, Marcus leaving the office, Laura closing her laptop, Ethan greeting her at the door with steady warmth. But something inside her betrayed her resolve. Her pulse quickened at the wrong times, her smile stretched too wide, and though she dismissed it as harmless, the seed had already taken root. She told herself she was still faithful, still loyal. And she was. But desire does not need action to grow. It only needs space. And Marcus's presence, no matter how ordinary, had already begun to widen a quiet crack in the life Laura once believed was unshakable. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the hallway clock. Ethan had already gone to bed, his breathing steady and untroubled, while Laura curled on the couch, the glow of her phone painting her face in the dark. She told herself she was only scrolling to relax, but her search history told another story. Words she would never say aloud betrayed the restlessness she carried inside. Emotional affairs. open marriage success stories, polyamory, and love. At first, she laughed nervously at what she found. Strangers online wrote with boldness, claiming they had built marriages stronger by opening them, insisting that honesty and boundaries created freedom rather than chaos. One woman described her life as empowered after convincing her husband to let her take a lover. She wrote about it as if it were not betrayal but evolution. Shock should have been Laura's response. Instead, her heart beat faster. The words had a dangerous pull, not seductive in a physical sense, but intoxicating in the possibilities they promised. They painted pictures of women who refused to choose, women who held on to the devotion of a steady husband while also tasting the thrill of someone new. Laura closed her eyes and imagined it just for a moment. Ethan at her side during family dinners, steady and dependable. Marcus's laughter tucked into the corners of her day, secret and electric. The fantasy felt absurd, shameful, and yet her pulse betrayed her. It was intoxicating. She scrolled further, diving into forums where anonymous voices debated love and loyalty. Some dismissed monogamy as a prison. Others defended it as sacred. But the comments that lingered were from women who swore they loved their husbands and their lovers, who insisted they had found a way to balance both without losing either. Their words slipped into Laura's heart like contraband, dangerous but impossible to discard. She knew Ethan would never see it that way. His values were carved in stone, his sense of fidelity unwavering. And yet, lying in the dim light, Laura found herself whispering the question in her mind, what if I could have both? That night, she placed her phone face down on the nightstand and slid beneath the covers. Ethan stirred, half asleep, and reached for her hand. His touch was warm, grounding, a tether to the life they had built. But even as she clung to it, the glow of those online confessions lingered in her thoughts. She drifted into uneasy sleep, carrying with her the weight of justifications she had not yet spoken aloud. What began as harmless curiosity was no longer harmless. Each article she reread, each confession she memorized, pressed deeper into her imagination. The fantasy grew roots in silence, weaving itself into her thoughts until even Ethan's presence could not erase it. Loyalty, once unshakable, began to bend under the weight of desire, and in the quiet of her mind, a hunger she never expected began to grow. Sunday mornings had always been their sanctuary. Sunlight spilled lazily across the white sheets, painting the room in golden streaks, while the quiet hum of the city still slept outside. Ethan lay half awake beside her, scrolling through the news on his phone, steady and calm, while Laura nestled against his shoulder, pretending to read an article she hadn't absorbed. On the surface, it was another ordinary morning. But beneath her calm breathing, a storm was twisting. The words from countless late-night blogs pressed against her lips, restless and insistent. She had rehearsed this question in silence, swallowed it again and again, convincing herself it was better left unspoken. Ethan's values were unshakable, his devotion unquestioned. He was the kind of man who saw commitment as sacred, who would never gamble with loyalty. And yet the seed of curiosity had grown too loud. She hesitated, her heart racing. A dozen times she nearly silenced the thought, choosing instead to talk about groceries or weekend errands. But desire has a way of finding its voice, even when reason begs for silence. Before she could stop herself, the words slipped out, fragile but clear enough to shatter everything. "What do you think about open marriages?" The air froze. Ethan lowered his phone slowly, his gaze shifting from soft and distracted to sharp, searching. The calm of the morning evaporated in an instant. His jaw tightened, his voice carried the weight of certainty. "That's not love," he said flatly. "If someone wants that, they should just get divorced." The words struck like a hammer. Laura forced a laugh, trying to disguise the tremor in her voice. She waved it off as something she had read online, a harmless curiosity, a passing thought. But Ethan's eyes lingered on her, unblinking. It wasn't anger that filled his stare, it was suspicion. He knew her too well, the slight tremor in her hand, the forced brightness in her tone, the nervous way she twisted the blanket between her fingers. She stumbled into other topics, groceries, errands, the weather, grasping at anything to erase the moment. Ethan answered, but his voice was edged with something new, something cold. And in that silence between their words, a fracture formed, thin, invisible, but destined to spread. The rest of the day carried on as if nothing had happened. Coffee brewed, errands were run, television hummed in the background. Yet nothing felt the same. Laura sensed the change in his tone, the hesitation in his touch, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long before looking away. She promised herself she would never bring it up again. She told herself it had been nothing more than a careless slip. But the truth pressed against her chest, undeniable. That single question had not been harmless, it had been confession. A signal that somewhere inside her, in a place Ethan had never been allowed to see, she was no longer fully his. And though the house remained quiet, though love appeared steady from the outside, Ethan's doubt had already taken root. Like a shadow at the edge of the bed, it would never truly leave. Night fell heavy over the house, cloaking the rooms in silence broken only by the hum of the heater and the faint creak of wood as it settled in the cold. Ethan lay beside her, his breath steady, but Laura could not rest. The words she had spoken that morning, the question she should never have asked, still echoed in her head. Ethan's silence since then was worse than rage. His eyes, when they met hers, had been too sharp, too knowing. His touch at dinner was mechanical, his voice clipped, warmth held back. Laura turned on her side, pretending to drift into sleep. But Ethan was not a man who ignored shadows. He had always been precise, always searching for truth where others might look away. Tonight, that precision came for her. "Who were you thinking about?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that pressed into her chest. "When you asked me that question this morning." Her body froze, the blood pounded in her ears. She whispered back, as if ignorance could save her. "What question?" "The one about open marriages." He shifted, turning until his eyes, dark and unwavering, locked onto hers. "Women don't ask that unless there's someone else already on their mind." Her throat went dry. She wanted to deny it, to bury it beneath another nervous laugh, but Ethan's gaze pinned her like a spotlight. The silence stretched, unbearable, until it cracked. "There's someone," she admitted finally, her voice trembling. The words were barely louder than a breath, but they landed like a stone. Ethan did not move. His jaw tightened, but his control was terrifying. He waited, letting her fill the silence with the truth she had tried to suppress. "It's Marcus," she whispered. "The delivery driver. We've only talked, nothing more, just small conversations at work. I never cheated on you, Ethan. I never would." His exhale came slow, measured, but his reply cut deeper than a blade. "You already have. Do you know what an emotional affair is?" Laura frowned faintly, the term unfamiliar. "I know, I've never heard of it. It's when you give your heart, your excitement, your secret joy to someone who isn't your spouse. When your pulse races for another man while I'm lying next to you. That's betrayal, Laura. You don't need a bed to cheat." The words hollowed her out. Shame pressed against her like a weight too heavy to bear. She wanted to argue, to insist it wasn't real, that it wasn't dangerous, that she still loved him. But the truth betrayed her. Every time she lingered in the lobby, every laugh that lasted a little too long, every glance she replayed in her mind, each one was a betrayal, not of the body, but of the heart. "I didn't mean," she began, but Ethan's voice cut through. "You thought about him, didn't you, when you asked me that question? You wondered what it would be like to have him and keep me too." Tears blurred her vision. She reached for him instinctively, desperate to feel the warmth she feared she had already lost. But Ethan pulled back, his body stiff, his face unreadable. The distance in that moment felt colder than if he had struck her. She rolled onto her back, staring at the ceiling, the shame pressing down until it was hard to breathe. Words tangled in her throat, apologies that sounded hollow even before she spoke them. There was no defense, no excuse. The man beside her had given her everything, and she had given her pulse, her imagination, to another. And in that silence, she realized what Ethan had said was true. She had betrayed him already, just not in the way she had expected. Sometimes betrayal did not need a body. Sometimes the heart alone was enough. The house carried a silence that was no longer comfortable. It was fragile, brittle, like glass stretched too thin. After that night's confession, Laura moved through the days as if walking on eggshells, her hands careful, her voice gentle, her smiles forced. She cooked dinners with extra care, placing his favorite dishes on the table, hoping each bite might soften the edge in his eyes. She reached for his hand whenever she could, but he did not reach back. Ethan was not angry in the ways she had expected. He did not slam doors, did not raise his voice, did not accuse her outright. His restraint was far more terrifying. He watched her with a calm so sharp it felt like surveillance, as though he had already diagnosed the truth and was simply observing how far it would spread. His silence was not peace. It was strategy. On the third evening, after another dinner eaten in near quiet, Ethan set his fork down carefully and looked at her. His expression was unreadable, his tone steady, almost businesslike. "If you want to try it," he said, "then let's try it." Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat, she thought she had misheard him. "You mean an open marriage," she whispered. He nodded once, deliberate. "But there will be rules, strict ones." Her heart pounded so hard it echoed in her ears. Part of her wanted to scream that she hadn't meant it, that she was only curious, that she never truly wanted to walk through the door she had cracked open. But another part, curiosity's restless twin, leaned forward, trembling with anticipation. "What rules?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Ethan's reply came precise, each word like a nail driven into place. "Full disclosure. You tell me who, when, and where before it happens. You tell me afterward that it did happen. Spare me the details, but do not lie. And protection, always, no exceptions." The air between them thickened. Laura swallowed hard, nodding quickly as though obedience could erase the danger in his calm. "Yes, of course, I understand." Ethan leaned back, his eyes fixed on her. "If our love is strong, it should survive this, right?" The question sounded like a test, one she did not know how to pass. She clung to it as reassurance, convincing herself this was proof of his devotion, that he loved her enough to adapt, to bend, to give her freedom when most men would only demand chains. She told herself it was understanding, compromise, even trust. But Ethan's eyes betrayed him. They were cold, detached, carrying not the softness of love but the steel of calculation. He was not surrendering. He was preparing. He was watching. Laura mistook his quiet consent for mercy. She believed she had been given permission. In truth, Ethan had handed her a rope and was already waiting to see how tightly she would hang herself with it. The rain had stopped just before sunset, leaving the streets slick and glistening beneath the neon glow of storefront signs. Laura sat in her car outside a small bar wedged between a laundromat and a diner, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had rehearsed her excuses all day, working late, a last-minute project, maybe a detour with colleagues, but none of them calmed the thrum of nerves pounding in her chest. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "I'm inside." Her breath caught. For a long moment she stared at the glowing screen, torn between turning the key and driving home or opening the door to everything she wasn't ready to admit. Curiosity pushed harder than fear. She stepped out, the damp air curling against her skin as if to warn her of the danger waiting inside. The bar was dim, its lighting designed for secrets. Marcus rose from a corner booth the moment she entered. His smile was both familiar and charged with something unspoken, something that had lived in the pauses between their conversations. They ordered drinks, but the small talk faded quickly. He leaned closer, his voice low, teasing her gently about how she always pretended not to notice his attention. She laughed too quickly, cheeks warming, her defenses softening with every word. When his hand brushed hers across the table, she did not pull away. Instead, she let the moment linger, telling herself Ethan had agreed that she wasn't really betraying him. Permission, she whispered in her mind, even as her heart knew better. The kiss came fast, a sudden spark that flared into fire. Marcus leaned in and she let him. Her pulse surged, dizzy with the intensity of something both forbidden and inevitable. She knew this was the point of no return, yet she didn't resist. The flame burned hotter than her doubts, and the lines she had once believed unbreakable dissolved in the heat of a single kiss. Later in his apartment, hesitation gave way to hunger. Clothes scattered across the floor, laughter melted into gasps, and the rush of passion consumed her like a storm she could not control. For a fleeting hour, Laura lived the fantasy she had only imagined, intoxicated by the thrill of stepping into another life. But when it ended, she stood in the bathroom staring at her reflection in the mirror. Marcus's scent clung to her skin, sweet and suffocating. Her stomach twisted with shame. The fantasy had been intoxicating. The reality was unbearable. She dressed quickly, mumbling excuses while Marcus kissed her again, promising there would be more. She forced a faint smile, though guilt pressed heavy against her chest. At home, Ethan was in his office, typing quietly, his face lit by the glow of his computer screen. Laura steadied her breathing, forcing herself into routine. She prepared dinner, smiled when he entered the kitchen, and spoke of her workday as if nothing had happened. Ethan listened, expression calm, almost indifferent. But when she lay beside him that night, her body washed and her smile carefully in place, she could still feel Marcus's presence clinging to her. No amount of scrubbing could erase it. The truth had marked her now, invisible yet suffocating, like a perfume she could never wash away. Ethan did not confront her that night. He did not shout, demand answers, or accuse her directly. Instead, a new kind of silence entered their home, a silence heavier than words, deliberate and sharp, like a knife pressed against the skin without breaking it. He began coming home later than usual. Sometimes he claimed he had extra work, other times he offered no explanation at all. The texts that once came at lunchtime stopped. The calls he used to make on his commute went silent. When Laura asked where he had been, his replies were clipped, vague. Out, with some people. Don't worry about it. One night past midnight, the front door opened. Laura was waiting in the living room, anxiety clawing at her chest. The moment Ethan stepped in, she smelled it, perfume, sweet and floral, clinging to his clothes. Her stomach turned. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice too sharp for someone carrying guilt of her own. Ethan's eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. Out. That single word cut deeper than any confrontation. He walked past her without another glance, leaving a trail of silence more punishing than rage could ever be. Jealousy burned hot inside her. She had no right, she knew it. She was the one who had crossed the line first. But the thought of Ethan with another woman shredded her from the inside. She imagined him laughing the way Marcus had made her laugh, imagined him touching someone else with the same steady tenderness he had once reserved for her. It was unbearable, and yet she could say nothing. His distance became deliberate, his patterns too precise to be accidental. He locked the bathroom door when he showered, a small act that struck her like a verdict. He slipped into the guest room on some nights without explanation. The marriage bed, once their sanctuary, became a hollow place where only her guilt remained. Laura tried to bridge the gap. She cooked his favorite dinners, set the table with candles, even wore lingerie she had not touched in years. Ethan accepted the meals, gave polite thanks, and rolled away when she reached for him. Every unanswered text, every glance that passed through her like glass was part of his punishment. He had not only agreed to her rules, he was now living by them. She had wanted openness, freedom, the chance to taste something forbidden. Ethan gave her that in return, but twisted it into a weapon. He answered her betrayal not with fire, but with indifference, and that indifference was merciless. Anger could be fought, tears could be soothed, arguments could be survived. But Ethan's coldness was like poison, slow, precise, leaving her to rot in her own shame while he carried himself with unnerving calm. Each day the man she once knew slipped further away. And in the silence he left behind, Laura realized the truth. Ethan's revenge was not in what he said, but in what he withheld. He would let her drown, not by holding her under, but by stepping back and watching her flail in the waters she had chosen herself. The first night Ethan carried his pillow into the guest bedroom, Laura told herself it was temporary. He spoke calmly, almost clinically, as if reading from a set of rules he had already written. "It's for safety," he said evenly, "until you're tested." His tone left no room for debate. The door closed with quiet finality, and the sound echoed in her chest like the crack of shattering glass. At first, she treated it like a practical matter. She scheduled the appointment, insisted she had been careful, repeated over and over that it wasn't necessary. But Ethan's eyes were flat, his voice unyielding. Until then, he said again. "I'm not sharing a bed with you." The nights grew colder without him beside her. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the faint creak of the guest bed when he turned over, the distant sound of water running in the bathroom. Each detail reminded her of what she had lost, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a slow, deliberate retreat. Laura tried everything she could think of to bridge the distance. She cooked elaborate dinners, hoping food might carry her apology. She bought his favorite wine, set the table with candles, pretended it was a celebration rather than a desperate plea. Ethan ate politely, thanked her quietly, and then carried his pillow down the hall again. One night, trembling with fear of losing him completely, she dressed in lingerie she hadn't touched in years. She stood at the doorway of his room, heart pounding. Ethan looked up, his face unreadable, and simply shook his head. Not cruelly, not angrily, just firmly. Then he closed the door between them. Apologies spilled from her lips in every corner of the house, murmured over the sink, sent in text messages, whispered through tears in the living room. "I'm sorry, I love you, please don't give up on me." But each word fell uselessly against the wall he had built. His punishment wasn't shouting, wasn't accusation. It was indifference, a steady, unmovable silence that left no space for her to repair what she had broken. She realized, slowly and painfully, that Ethan was no longer fighting for their marriage. He wasn't pleading, wasn't arguing, wasn't asking anything of her at all. He was simply withdrawing, letting her drown in the consequences of her own choices. Every night, she pressed her ear against the thin wall between their rooms, as if listening for his breathing might tether her back to him. But the wall was more than plaster and wood. It was a verdict. And each morning she woke alone, she understood with sharper clarity. Ethan's love wasn't being tested anymore. It was already gone, retreating behind walls she would never climb again. Easter morning should have felt like a celebration, a return to warmth and family. The pastel decorations hung in shop windows, the air carried the smell of roasted ham drifting from neighborhood kitchens, and Laura's parents had already called twice, asking when she and Ethan would arrive. She had smiled tightly into the phone, offering vague reassurances. "He's just tied up with work. We'll be there soon." Each word tasted like ash, because the truth was harsher than anything she could admit. Ethan had refused to go. When she asked him that morning, standing in the kitchen with hope trembling in her voice, he didn't even look up from his coffee. "No," just one word, clipped and final. He rinsed his cup, set it in the sink, and walked into the guest room, closing the door behind him. And so Laura drove alone. The empty seat beside her felt louder than any confession. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned pale, and in the silence of the car, the weight of her choices pressed harder than ever before. Her family greeted her warmly at first. Her mother kissed her cheek, her father asked about Ethan, her sister teased lightly about him being late again. Laura tried to hold the mask steady. "An urgent project," she said. "He couldn't make it." But the words were thin, brittle, already cracking. By dessert, the mask shattered. Her sister's cutting questions, her father's raised brow, her mother's silence. It was too much. Laura's voice broke as tears spilled. She confessed in fragments, words tumbling like shards of glass. She admitted Ethan hadn't wanted to come. She admitted things weren't the same. She admitted she had made mistakes she could not undo. The room turned cold. Her mother's face hardened, her father's chair scraped back against the floor, and her sister's voice rose, sharp and merciless. "How could you throw away everything? For what? Some cheap thrill?" The words cut deeper than even Ethan's silence. There was no sympathy, no comfort, only judgment, only anger. Laura sat frozen, her hands trembling around her napkin. The pastel decorations mocked her from every corner, symbols of renewal and joy that she no longer had a right to claim. For the first time, she realized that her betrayal had not only cost her husband, it had cost her the respect of her family. When she drove home later, the streets felt emptier than they had that morning. The pastel banners fluttered in the breeze as she pulled away from her parents' house, their brightness almost cruel in contrast to the darkness settling inside her. She had once believed holidays could heal, that traditions could anchor a family through storms. But this Easter was no celebration. It was a courtroom, and she had been found guilty. And when she returned to her own home, the silence waiting in Ethan's eyes was harsher than anything her family had said. The morning after Easter, Laura returned to her parents' house, clinging to a fragile hope that a night's sleep might have softened their anger. The drive felt endless, her mind rehearsing apologies, searching for words that could undo the wreckage of yesterday. But the moment she stepped through the door, she knew the storm had not passed. Her mother's eyes were red from crying. Her father stood rigid, his face carved in disappointment. Her sister crossed her arms, gaze sharp, posture tense, as though she had been waiting to deliver a verdict. The words came fast, sharp, merciless. Her father's voice was heavy with condemnation. "You were reckless, Laura. You betrayed everything we taught you." Her mother's voice, though softer, was soaked in despair. "We raised you better than this. How could you throw it all away?" But her sister's words struck the hardest, cold, cutting, unrelenting. "You're selfish. You had everything, love, stability, respect, and you threw it away for nothing. Do you even realize how pathetic that is?" Each sentence was a blade, leaving Laura raw and trembling. She tried to explain, fumbling with excuses that even she no longer believed. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, I thought." Her sister cut her off with a sharp laugh, dripping with contempt. "You thought wrong. You wanted to play games with your marriage, and now you're shocked you lost. Don't expect sympathy." The weight of shame pressed down, smothering her voice. For the first time, she realized she wasn't only losing Ethan, she was losing her family too. The people who had once been her shelter were now a jury, and their judgment was absolute. Her parents' anger eventually softened into sadness, their voices trembling with prayers that she might find redemption. But even then, the disappointment remained. Their hugs were colder, their eyes carried pity instead of pride. That night, Laura retreated to her childhood bedroom, the same walls still lined with posters and photographs from another lifetime. She curled on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in the place that had once defined her innocence. The air smelled the same, the room looked unchanged, but nothing about it belonged to her anymore. Tears came in waves, not just for Ethan, but for the daughter she could no longer be. She understood with brutal clarity that she had become a cautionary tale. Not the admired daughter, not the dependable sister, but the whispered example of failure, a reminder of how quickly trust and respect could vanish. Alone in the quiet, she buried her face in the pillow, muffling her sobs until exhaustion claimed her. The house that had once been her refuge now felt like exile. And in that silence, Laura realized her disgrace had gone beyond her marriage. She had lost her family's faith, their pride, their unconditional love. And some losses, she feared, could never be repaired. When Laura returned home that evening, the house was too still. Not the ordinary quiet of a man working in his office or dozing in the living room, but an emptiness that pressed against her skin like a warning. She called Ethan's name once, then again, louder this time. No answer. Her eyes landed on the kitchen counter. A folded note waited there, small and sharp as a blade. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "I'll be gone for a week. Don't wait up." That was all. No explanation, no warmth, not even a trace of affection. Just a sentence that cut deeper than any argument could. Panic clawed at her chest. She dialed his number immediately, clinging to the sound of the ringing, praying for his voice. But the call slipped into voicemail. She texted him, first short messages, then long streams of pleading words. "Where are you? Please talk to me. I'm scared. I'm sorry. I love you." Hours passed. No response. The nights that followed became a torment. She lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering how he used to lean down and brush a kiss across her forehead before leaving for work. That gentle ritual, once so ordinary, now felt like a miracle she had squandered. Every tick of the clock mocked her, reminding her that Ethan's absence was deliberate. Her mind tormented her with endless possibilities. Perhaps he was traveling for work. Perhaps he was with friends. Or perhaps, and this thought clawed at her most violently, he was with another woman. The perfume she had smelled on his clothes weeks ago returned to her memory, sweet and poisonous. The jealousy burned, but so did the emptiness. It wasn't only fear of where he was, it was the cruelty of his silence, the certainty that he had chosen to remove himself from her life without offering her a chance to follow. Each hour became its own punishment. With every unanswered call, Ethan's message grew louder. She no longer had a claim on him. The man who once shared every detail of his day now left her stranded in a prison of uncertainty. By the end of the week, her phone was filled with unanswered texts, messages she wished she could unsend, apologies that read like begging, promises that sounded like desperation. Still, nothing came back. Ethan had disappeared, not into death or disaster, but into choice. He had chosen a world without her, and his silence was more devastating than any goodbye. The end did not arrive with slammed doors or shouted words. It came quietly, almost politely, on a gray afternoon while rain tapped against the kitchen window. Laura sat at the dining table, waiting, her stomach knotted with dread. She told herself Ethan's absence had been temporary, that maybe the silence could still be broken, that perhaps there was still time to repair what she had torn apart. Then Ethan entered the room. His steps were steady, his expression unreadable, a folder clutched in his hands with chilling precision. Without a word, he placed it on the table and slid it toward her. The bold letters on the front cut through her like glass, petition for dissolution of marriage. Her fingers trembled as they touched the edge of the paper, as though the ink itself might burn her. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "please, we can work through this. I'll do anything. I'll change." He shook his head slowly. His eyes were cold, not with rage, but with certainty. "You already made your choice, Laura. This," he tapped the folder lightly with his finger, "is just the consequence." Her words tumbled out in desperation, clumsy and frantic. "It was a mistake. I was confused. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. We can." "There's nothing to fix," Ethan interrupted, his tone calm but merciless. "You wanted to open the marriage. You opened it. Now it's closed forever." Tears blurred her vision, dripping onto the papers that demanded her signature. She remembered their wedding day, the flowers in her hair, the vows spoken in front of family and friends, the promises that once felt unbreakable. All of it had been reduced to lines of legal text, cold and impersonal. The house around her felt hollow, stripped of the warmth it once held. The kitchen where they had laughed over burnt toast, the bedroom where they had whispered dreams in the dark, all of it seemed haunted now, echoing with what had been lost. Laura wanted to scream, to tear the papers apart, to force Ethan to see the love that still burned desperately in her chest. But Ethan's face did not waver. He was no longer the man she could reach. He had already mourned the marriage, buried it, and walked away from the grave. With a trembling hand, she picked up the pen. Each letter of her name felt like a death sentence written by her own hand. When the last stroke dried, Ethan gathered the papers with neat precision, as though they were nothing more than a business contract. He stood, pushed his chair back quietly, and said only 2 words. "It's over." The door closed behind him, leaving Laura at the table, her tears falling onto polished wood. The home that had once been filled with love now echoed only with endings. The months after the divorce did not pass. They dragged, slow and colorless, each day blending into the next like an endless corridor. Laura moved through life mechanically. She rose each morning, dressed for work, smiled faintly at colleagues, and returned to an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. She ate because her body demanded it, not because food had any taste. She slept because exhaustion eventually pulled her under, not because dreams offered comfort. Marcus was gone almost immediately. The thrill he had once represented dissolved the moment her world collapsed. His texts stopped within days, as if even he knew their connection had been built on fragile, shifting ground. When Laura scrolled through her phone late at night, his name was nothing more than a reminder of the spark that had burned her life to ash. Her family kept their distance. Phone calls replaced visits, their voices careful, clipped, as though speaking to her too warmly might condone her choices. Holidays came with strained invitations. "You're welcome to come, but don't expect things to be the same." She understood. She had shifted in their eyes from daughter to disappointment, from sister to warning. But it was Ethan's absence that haunted her most. Though he was alive somewhere, building a future without her, his presence lingered like a ghost. Every corner of her apartment carried echoes of him. The shoes he once lined neatly by the door, The sound of his laugh when she teased him, the way he kissed her forehead each morning as if to seal the day with love. She replayed those gestures every night, clinging to them the way a prisoner clings to memories of freedom. The haunting was cruel. Each memory replayed not as comfort, but as punishment. She saw more clearly the moments she had destroyed it all, the question about open marriage, the confession of Marcus, the pen scratching her name onto divorce papers. These images circled endlessly, a cruel film she could not stop, reminding her that she had authored her own ruin. She told herself she was surviving. She went to work, paid her bills, performed the rituals of adulthood. But she was not living. Laughter no longer came naturally. Conversations felt hollow. The meaning of companionship, of love, of belonging, all of it had been stripped away. She was left with silence and guilt, her punishment stretching not across weeks or months, but through an entire year of emptiness. At night, lying in bed, Laura whispered apologies into the dark. Not because Ethan could hear them, he was gone, but because the words would not stay inside her. They became her ritual, her nightly confession to no one, her endless plea to a man who would never answer again. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of a week that looked no different from all the others Laura had endured for months. She sat at her desk at work, staring blankly at a spreadsheet when her phone lit up. A number she had once memorized by heart, one she thought she would never see again, flashed across the screen. 2 words, "Can we meet?" Her breath caught. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. For a long moment she just stared, unable to decide whether to reply or to delete the message as if it had never existed. But longing overpowered hesitation. She typed back quickly, her heart racing in a rhythm she had not felt in nearly a year. They met at a quiet cafe tucked away from the noise of the city, a place chosen deliberately, far from the eyes of family, friends, or gossip. When Ethan walked through the door, Laura's breath left her chest. He looked the same and yet impossibly different. His frame was still strong, his movements still deliberate, but his eyes had changed. Sharper, colder, as if life had carved steel into them. And yet when their gazes locked, the familiarity hit her like a tidal wave. The years together, the laughter, the promises, they all surged back in an instant. Their conversation began politely, almost awkwardly. They asked about work, about family, about things that didn't matter. The words were shallow, but beneath them the air pulsed with something heavier, something they both pretended not to feel, until finally the pretense collapsed. Later that evening, they found themselves in a hotel room as if carried there by gravity too strong to resist. Passion erupted, wild and consuming, stripping away the distance that time had built. Laura clung to him desperately, whispering apologies between frantic kisses. "I'm sorry, I'm better now, I'll never fail you again. Please, Ethan, I'll be different this time." She poured out every promise, every plea, every shred of devotion left in her. To her, this was redemption. This was the miracle she had begged for in countless lonely nights. She believed their love had been resurrected in the fire of that reunion. But Ethan's response was cold, steady, devastating. As he buttoned his shirt, his voice cut through her illusions. "This isn't about that. Don't mistake this for anything more." The words gutted her. She forced a smile, nodding, clinging to the scraps he had given her. Even if this was only physical, she told herself, it was still a beginning, still a chance. Nights with Ethan became a pattern, unannounced meetings, fleeting hours of passion, and his inevitable departure before dawn. No promises, no explanations, just the echo of footsteps leaving. Laura convinced herself it was enough, that if she gave him her loyalty, her devotion, her body without condition, one day his heart would follow. She told herself this was the path back, even as his words echoed again and again in her mind. No promises, no future. She accepted the terms, surrendering dignity for closeness, pride for the illusion of hope, blind to the truth that Ethan wasn't giving her a second chance at love. He was giving her a reminder of what she had destroyed and the cruel mercy of letting her taste it one last time. What began as occasional reunions soon became Laura's lifeline. Each time Ethan's name appeared on her phone, her pulse surged, her breath quickened, Her entire world narrowed to that single notification. She rearranged her schedule without hesitation, skipped outings with coworkers, ignored calls from family. Nothing mattered except the possibility of seeing him again. The hours in between were unbearable. She lived in a constant state of waiting, checking her phone every few minutes, replaying his last words, analyzing the smallest gestures for hidden meaning. And when the call finally came, she rushed to him without a second thought, her dignity left behind like an old coat she no longer cared to wear. Their nights together were fire, consuming, intoxicating, cruel in their intensity. Laura convinced herself this was love reborn. That passion this fierce could only mean something real. She began to dream again, weaving fantasies out of their fleeting encounters. In her mind, she saw them remarrying, saw the children they had once imagined, saw Christmas mornings filled with laughter and chaos. She clung to those illusions as if sheer devotion could bend reality back into shape. But reality was merciless. Ethan never spoke of the future. He never lingered in the morning, never let tenderness slip into his voice. He dressed quickly, left with a brief nod, and disappeared until the next time he chose to return. His boundaries were sharp, his terms unyielding. This is physical, nothing more. Laura buried those words deep inside, smothering them beneath her fantasies. She told herself love had to start somewhere. She convinced herself that if she proved her loyalty, if she surrendered enough, waited long enough, his heart would eventually soften. But the more she gave, the emptier she felt. Each meeting left her hungrier, not just for his body, but for his trust, his forgiveness, his permanence. She craved the Ethan who once kissed her forehead every morning, not the man who now treated her presence as a temporary indulgence. Her desire became a prison. Each chain was forged by her own longing, each lock fastened by the hope she refused to release. Nights without him were torture, hours spent pacing the apartment, whispering prayers that he might call. Days blurred into exhaustion, her thoughts consumed by the fantasy of belonging to him again. But Ethan's resolve never wavered. He gave her pieces of himself, but never the part she wanted most. He allowed her into his bed, but not into his life. And for him, that was enough. For her, it was torment. She told herself she was free, but every choice she made drew the shackles tighter. Laura had traded her pride for scraps of affection, her dignity for fleeting passion. And though she would not admit it aloud, deep down she knew she was no longer fighting for love. She was clinging to chains, shackled by a desire that would never set her free. Laura found herself drifting more and more into daydreams. They came without invitation, often in the still moments, staring at the ceiling of her lonely apartment, folding laundry in silence, or waking to the cold emptiness of the other side of her bed. Her mind did not return to Marcus, nor even to the reckless thrill that had once ignited her downfall. Instead, it circled endlessly around the life she and Ethan had almost built together, the phantom of a future that never came. She imagined Christmas mornings with children racing down the stairs, stockings hanging by the fireplace, Ethan lifting a little one into his arms while she laughed from the couch. She saw summers by the lake, Ethan teaching their son to fish while she helped their daughter build sandcastles in the sand. She remembered the whispered late-night conversations where they had argued gently about baby names, about schools, about who would be the stricter parent. All of it had felt so close once, so certain. Now it was nothing but ash. Holidays no longer brought joy. They were reminders. Easter had collapsed under her family's outrage. Christmas passed with silence instead of laughter. Birthdays slipped by with no one beside her to celebrate. Even her parents' home, once her refuge, now felt like a courtroom where every glance, every word was weighted with judgment. What twisted the knife deeper was the loss of her very name. When she married Ethan, she had signed his surname with pride, feeling whole and anchored in something permanent. That name had been a promise of forever, but divorce had stripped it away. She returned to her maiden name, a word that once felt comforting but now felt hollow, like a coat she had outgrown. Each time she wrote it, she felt the absence of what it no longer carried. Laura began to realize her punishment was not only the absence of Ethan's love. It was the erasure of the entire legacy they might have built together. She mourned not just the man she betrayed, but the children they never had, the milestones they never reached, the home they never filled with laughter. She grieved a future that would never belong to her again because she had destroyed it with her own hands. Every imagined scene became a wound. Every memory turned into regret. She carried them like ghosts, shadows of a family that had never existed, but haunted her more deeply than the mistakes that had ended the life she did have. Alone in the silence, she understood. The true tragedy was not only losing Ethan. It was losing the chance to be part of something greater than herself. Family, future, forever. The walls of Laura's world grew narrower with each passing week. It was not only Ethan who had withdrawn, it was everyone. Friends who once filled her weekends with brunches, movie nights, and casual laughter now disappeared quietly as if slipping out the back door of her life. Invitations dried up. Messages went unanswered. And when she did cross paths with them, their smiles were forced, their voices stiff, their eyes darting away as though her presence might stain them. Her community whispered. At the grocery store, neighbors who once greeted her warmly now offered only curt nods, their glances sharp and lingering. At the coffee shop, she caught fragments of gossip. That's her, the one who ruined her marriage, the one who thought an open relationship was freedom. The words struck harder than they should have, but what silenced her even more was the pause that always followed, the refusal to acknowledge her as anything more than a scandal. The places she once loved became hostile. Her favorite cafe felt colder. The park where she had once walked hand in hand with Ethan was now haunted by judgmental stares. Even the church pews she had prayed in seemed to tighten around her like a cage. Everywhere she went, eyes followed. Some avoided her, some whispered, and others looked at her with pity that cut even deeper than contempt. Ethan played his role in her punishment with the same precision he had shown in every other part of his life. Whenever they crossed paths in public, his indifference sliced through her. He did not acknowledge her, did not soften even for appearances. To him, she was not even worth the pretense of civility. He moved past her like she was a stranger, and in doing so gave permission for the world to do the same. Laura realized she had not only lost Ethan, she had lost belonging. She was invisible, not in the mercy of being unseen, but in the cruelty of being noticed only for her mistakes. To her community, she was no longer Laura the wife, or Laura the daughter, or Laura the friend. She was a cautionary tale, the woman who opened her marriage and destroyed everything. Shame does not shout, it whispers. It lingers in pauses, in silences, in invitations that never arrive. It isolates slowly, until one morning, Laura woke and understood with chilling clarity. Her circle had shrunk to no one but herself, and in that suffocating silence, she realized her punishment was not just Ethan's revenge, not just her family's disappointment. It was exile. A quiet, merciless exile from the life she once believed unshakable. It was late in the evening when Laura finally heard the words that sealed her fate. She had begged Ethan to meet, clinging desperately to the fragile hope that their secret encounters had softened him, that somewhere beneath his indifference a flicker of love might still remain. They sat across from each other in the dim corner of a quiet restaurant. Laura's hands trembled around her glass of water as she searched his face for something familiar. Warmth, mercy, even a shadow of the man who had once promised her forever. Instead, she found only a wall of ice. Her voice cracked as she asked the question she had dreaded yet could not resist. "Ethan, can you ever forgive me?" He did not hesitate. His eyes, steady and merciless, held hers as he spoke the words that shattered her completely. "I can never trust you again." The sentence fell heavier than any scream. It was not delivered with anger nor whispered in sorrow. It came with the calm certainty of a man who had already weighed every option and chosen his path. For Ethan, trust was not negotiable, and she had demolished it beyond repair. Laura tried to argue, her words spilling out in a rush. She reminded him of the years they had shared, the love they had built before her fall. She swore she had changed, that she would spend every day proving her devotion if only he gave her another chance. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pleaded for a scrap of hope. But Ethan's expression never softened. He shook his head slowly, like a judge delivering a final verdict. "Divorce was my revenge. My freedom is your punishment." The words sliced through her, crueler than silence, sharper than rage. All along, she had believed his indifference, his distance, his calculated coldness were temporary. That if she suffered long enough, humbled herself deeply enough, he might one day let her back in. But his words made it clear the punishment was not meant to end. Her suffering was the point. The marriage was gone, dissolved in legal ink. Ethan had rebuilt his life without her, free of the burden she had placed on him, and she was left shackled to regret, condemned to carry the weight of her own betrayal until the end of her days. Ethan stood, placed money on the table, and walked away without a backward glance. Laura sat frozen, staring at the empty chair across from her. Around her, the restaurant buzzed with laughter and conversation, but it all sounded distant, muffled, as though she were sealed behind glass. She understood now. Betrayal does not end with signatures on paper. Its true cost is eternal, the loss of trust that can never be restored, the love that can never be reclaimed, the knowledge that some wounds are carved too deep to ever heal. For Laura, the heavy price of betrayal was not only losing Ethan, it was knowing she would live the rest of her life as the architect of her own ruin. Laura's world did not end with shouting, nor with the crash of slammed doors. It ended with silence, a silence that seeped into every corner of her apartment, filling the space where laughter, love, and routine had once lived. She came home each night to an emptiness that mocked her. The couch still carried the faint impression of Ethan's favorite spot. The kitchen drawers still held the order he had once kept with quiet pride. Even the bedroom seemed haunted by the ghost of his presence, the memory of his steady breathing, the warmth of his body beside hers. Now all of it was gone. She replayed everything in her mind over and over until the moments blurred into torture. The Sunday morning when she had asked the question that should never have been spoken. The restless curiosity that led her to Marcus. The night she crossed the line and gave away her body, believing it was freedom. The day she signed her name on the divorce papers, each stroke carving her fate deeper. Her family's voices still echoed in her memory, her mother's disappointment, her father's stern silence, her sister's cruel contempt. Her community's whispers followed her like shadows, reducing her to nothing more than a scandal, a woman defined not by years of loyalty but by a single selfish choice. But none of that compared to the loss of Ethan. He had been her anchor, her promise of forever, her proof that love could be steady in a world built on instability. And now he was gone, not in rage, not even in betrayal, but in something far worse. He had walked away. He had chosen silence. Ethan's revenge was not fire or fury. It was absence. It was indifference. It was leaving her alone with the ruins she had created, forcing her to face them every day until her last breath. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with tears that brought no relief. Days blurred into monotony, her routine mechanical, her soul hollow. She whispered apologies into the air, knowing no one was listening. They were no longer pleas to win him back, but confessions to herself, a way of admitting the truth she could never escape. She had gambled her marriage for a thrill, and in the end, she lost everything: her husband, her family, her place in the world, and the future she once dreamed of. The final act of her story was not filled with noise, but with quiet. A suffocating quiet that pressed against her chest like a weight too heavy to carry. And so Laura lived on, not with anger, not even with hope, but with silence. The kind of silence that echoed louder than any scream, the kind of silence that would follow her until her last breath. And so the story of she opened the marriage door and lost everything in the end comes to a close. Laura believed she could balance safety and thrill, but betrayal always carries a price, and sometimes silence is the cruelest punishment of all. What would you do if faced with the same temptation? Could trust ever return once it's been broken? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching Cheating Stories 7. If this story moved you, remember to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take this lesson with you. Once trust is lost, it may never come back.